Tempe had read on the subject. The magnetic potentials, focused by remote control, oriented the spins of the atomic nuclei along the lines of force. When the field was switched off, the nuclei gave back the energy imposed on them. Each element of the periodic table then vibrated according to its own resonance. The picture recorded in the receptor was a nuclear portrait in cross-section, where sextillions of Atmos performed the role of the dots in an ordinary half-tone photo engraving. The advantage of high-powered nuclear imaging was its harmlessness for the material objects examined, which included living beings. The disadvantage was that, applying such power, one could not conceal the source of the transmission. Hey, this is Nick.
And this is David, and today we are reading Stanisław Lem's Fiasco, and joining us today is my old friend Mike, who introduced me to Lem through the very long Russian adaptation of Solaris many years ago.
Hey, this is Mike. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we're about to do something I think we've never done on the Boss Podcast before, which is talk about a book that we've all kind of not liked, which is going to be tricky. So we're digging into Fiasco, which is this like super technical, very science-heavy, maybe hard sci-fi, a lot of futurism, a lot of philosophy, kind of 90% essay, 10% fiction, and it's a bit of a struggle. So just kind of tossing it back to Mike is, how do you deal with this kind of book?
One page at a time. Yeah, I'm not that used to the hard sci-fi stuff, so it was a bit of a struggle. Even really from the first chapter, the kind of creaky storytelling was apparent. There is a lot of essay type explanation of futuristic technology. I think this book took a long time to write. Probably he thought about it a lot. He had to do a lot of, research and a lot of just thinking about it. But it seems like the storytelling really got shortchanged.
Yeah. I looked into a little bit of Lem's history, and this is one of, if not the last book he wrote.
I think that's true, yeah.
At this point, he was doing a lot of physics, which I think shows in the novel, and it's definitely hard sci-fi. I've read my fair share of science fiction growing up. I've read my fair share of, first contact stories, which is essentially what this book is upending in a way, right? Because it kind of leads or teases you into this idea of first contact, which doesn't come until the last paragraph, more or less, of the book,
yeah,
which can be quite frustrating.
It's very much not... The alien reaches out their finger, and the human boy touches that finger, and there's a moment of beauty. It's not at all that kind of first contact.
Yeah, it's almost like he's trying to tell a story that is realistic in how communication is actually going to work in the real world, instead of just this like human fantasy that everything is related to us. And I think that's just not very digestible. It's not a fun story. There's like nothing that actually pulls you along unless you're somehow into just this cryptic idea of failed communication. And I know that's like kind of a theme he's played around with some of his other books.
Yeah.
His Master's Voice does that, and I think actually does that in a way that's a little bit more of a draw to the reader, whereas this is just like a hard bludgeon of just details and ideas like barely linked into some sort of cowboy like reanimated astronaut story that like doesn't really ever get developed
or need to be there really at all.
Yeah. And I don't know, I guess my question like for you guys is just, are we reading this the wrong way? Are there people out here who just like are really into this and we just don't get it because, I don't know, we're coming from the wrong angle?
Well, the first answer is yes, there are definitely people that get this. This was recommended to me by someone who knows science fiction, and when we were kind of deciding what to read, we were looking online and see what was rated very high, and this was considered one of his better books, which I don't understand at all. But people seem to love it, I think, because of the hard physics, the intense sort of hypotheses that he develops about how things function, how they'll work in the future. But
yeah,
I mean, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sure there are hard sci-fi book clubs out there who would just eat this up. It's just not what probably all three of us were expecting or hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, like he definitely drops these moments that I think are useful. I mean, they're definitely buried in between just like pages of super detailed descriptions about things that are maybe not like pulling along a narrative. But I just kind of want to read one of my favorite ones, kind of in like the futurism and like how to technology develop category. But he goes on to write, individual people on the microscopic scale always made inventions and discoveries, whether singly or in groups, but these creators could be factored out of the equation because it was inventions that gave rise to inventions and discoveries that led to discoveries. This acceleration described a parabola that seemed to soar to infinity. A saturation bend in the curve was not caused by other individuals who sought to protect the environment. The curve would bend only where a failure to bend would destroy the biosphere. Invariably, it would bend at the critical point, for if technologies for saving or replacing the biosphere did not come to the rescue of the technologies of expansion, the given civilization would enter a crisis to end all crises, i.e. extinction. With no air to breathe, there could be no one to make further discoveries and receive Nobel Prizes. And so, like, he can pull together this stuff that I feel like is a very astute observation on just the development of civilizations. He has lots of theories as to the window for kind of like the critical mass of these things. And then he's really playing around with the idea of artificial intelligence, how do simulations work, how do humans use them. And so like these things exist. And I think we kind of all agree that maybe this was just supposed to be an essay, but then he like threw it into a narrative because, I don't know, in all honesty, maybe that's how you get paid as a science fiction writer. Like,
right.
I don't totally know. But there are moments in here that I very much did appreciate. It's just a slog to find them.
Yeah. And I agree. And I think the quote that you read gets to what I think the main philosophical drive of this narrative is, which is that our technological advances will take us out into the world. It might take us past the extinction of the Earth itself, but we will always be limited by what our own sort of natural limits are as human beings in terms of understanding what else could be outside of the world. And I know this is something Lem likes to talk about when he brings in sort of his religious philosophy as well. But it applies to sciences. What is beyond the human may never be understood because of our own limitations. And I want to read a quote too, because I think his philosophizing was the best part of the book. Let me see if I have it lined up here. Yeah, the quote is, "And man craves ultimate truths. Every mortal mind, I think, is that way. But what is ultimate truth? It's the end of the road, where there is no more mystery, no more hope, and no more questions to ask, since all the answers have been given, but there is no such place." And it goes on to kind of develop this idea that we are limited by our anthropocentrism, which is this human limitation to understand something else.
Yeah, and I think he does a good job of developing that theme. There's no doubt. Right up till the end, when the pilot who's down on the Quinton planet just absolutely cannot recognize that the Quintons are all around him because he's expecting some kind of bipedal thing like him, to come greeting him. I agree that the theme is we're never going to get out of our human limitations, and even the technologies we create to bring us to these faraway places are going to be limited by what we've put into them. Deus, and that's the artificial intelligence system that's on the ship, the kind of HAL 9000 of this book. And it's limited in certain ways. It kind of gets irritated and it gives some sass back, and if you don't give it an exact instruction, it'll only carry out the instructions to the letter, kind of ignoring the spirit.
Yeah, it also does something human, which is lie. It lies to the team about part of its failure to communicate with the planet. Yeah. So
yeah, it has a mind of its own, really. It's trying to serve a greater good, and it will use deception if needed.
Yeah, I actually really liked a lot of those descriptions because I'm kind of coming at this thing as, a day job. I'm an engineer. I'm just pretending to, be capable of reading and stuff. But like there is always this element that's kind of interesting from like the oncoming artificial intelligence topic that is very prevalent. But it's all like has to be used by humans eventually. And so there's this topic with, are we pronouncing it Deus, Deus, the HAL-like intelligence system?
Like Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah. Oh, right. There was actually a joke of that in there somewhere.
Somewhere.
Yeah,
somewhere in the 300 plus pages of slog.
But there's this whole thing about how Deus monitors everyone from like a psychology standpoint to make sure it's okay. But since people don't ultimately trust anyone other than humans, it still has to come back through humans to be communicated. So they're the ultimate sort of dam for this information. which is sort of weird, right? Because if everybody is going crazy equally, and then everyone has to interpret that information to have anyone trust the information, then it inherently taints that information, which then just sort of ruins what the point of the whole thing is. And like, to me, that's such like an analog to just how like tools work in the engineering world and like the science world. Is just that we're only as good as our best interpretations and our ability to have confidence in these things. And if that human emotional side starts to get in the way of this hard data, then all of a sudden it's not hard data anymore. It is once again like tainted by our own just, weak frailty of the human psyche, right? And so I actually got a lot out of that felt, even as a sci-fi writer, I know he got very into science and philosophy and stuff, that he actually has this very tangible, correct feeling for how technology exists like within humans or within like the human world, but also how like we interact with it and its inherent limitations because of those.
Yeah. And I agree. And I actually think we are better serving this novel than it deserves in some way, because these ideas are amazing. I love talking about them. They're great to engage with, but it tries to hang itself on a very fragile piece of fiction that I don't think works as fiction. That's the bigger issue for me, is that the ideas are interesting, intriguing, worth discussing, but it's supposed to be a work of fiction. It's supposed to tell a good story in some way, and I don't think it does that.
But here's the question. If humans in this book are searching for intelligence in the form of themselves, are you searching for fiction in the form of fiction that you're familiar with?
I mean, I'm familiar with all types of fiction, man. I like everything. So I think as long as it tells a good story, no matter how it does that in whatever shape, that doesn't matter to me.
And I'm okay being, even if I sound like a super traditionalist, I'm okay saying fiction has to have characters. And not that there aren't named characters in here, but
yeah, there's names in this book.
If you ask me what Nakamura's job is, I couldn't tell you. I just know there's a Nakamura in the book. I think he may be one of the physicists, but he could be a doctor. I have no idea. These people are like super interchangeable. There's a doctor. For some reason, there's a Dominican monk on board. I don't know what his purpose is. And I was reading carefully, and I know how to read carefully and critically. I have that training, and a lot of them are just not distinguishable at all. So it's very difficult for me to call this a successful work of fiction. None of them really develop. I mean, Harak, however you pronounce that, goes a little blood simple, as Dashiell Hammett would say, and he goes nuts and he wants to fry everything on the planet. But that's like the only distinguishable feature about him.
Man, I really thought after like just pushing through half of this book, I thought that like it was going to be front loaded with all of this science shit, and then finally there was going to be like the maverick space cowboy, because he like hints at it just a little bit. The guy's reanimated. He has the ability to do math himself because he's from the old days, and he's got like just a little bit of like an anti-attitude, and he just doesn't even do anything with it.
Yeah, Parvis. He seems like he's the lead because he starts the book, and you get this huge backstory, which also has incredible detailed scientific writing. And then the next chapter, so many years later, all of that technology is pointless. He doesn't use anything that he learned or anything that was described. And really, there's no real point to him being reanimated. Like, he doesn't serve any purpose in the rest of the novel.
If it had been the first chapter and it was like a short story, I would have given this 4 out of 5 stars. Like, I like the first chapter.
Just by itself.
Yeah, by itself. So the Parvis, this pilot, he's like the hotshot young pilot. He arrives on one of Saturn's moons, and he learns that his old mentor, went out into the wild on that moon, and he's going to get into this giant walking mechanical strider thing and go find him. Okay, fair enough. And I thought it was interesting. I thought the storytelling, I thought that Lem was using kind of storytelling tropes in a deliberately, like, I keep coming back to the word creaky, kind of a winking way. But then
it goes out of its way to compare him to Parsifal.
Yeah, he kept throwing out these obvious references, like, just like that. And then he used the trope of, the established old-timers in this place are telling the young buck who comes into town, how it is. But he would keep interrupting them and say, yeah, I know all this. I got this in training. Like, you don't have to tell me what's out there when I take the walker out there. And I also found a kind of new version of Chekhov's gun, which is Lem's Vitrifax. Like, if you describe something that can freeze a person just before death and keep them in kind of suspended animation, then that thing must be used by the end of the chapter. But David, you're right. After this, he's reanimated. He doesn't really remember who he is, and everything that has come before seems to have been a waste of time. So I agree with David. I don't know what Nick's take on it is.
Yeah, I have to think that Lem knew what he was doing by not pursuing that, or like he didn't want to pursue that, because other fiction of his is not nearly this difficult. Oftentimes it's a little bit funny, it's a little bit light, right? So like I think he made a conscious decision to do this, and I keep trying to figure out if this is somehow his like hard sci-fi, just like plot line realism kind of thing where
Okay.
like yes, these are tropes, and he kind of slides up against them to like show that like he knows what they are, but you know, much like real life and much like real communication and all this stuff, they're not actually connected. It's kind of like, I don't know, and like an existential like reckoning of like what plots are or what they're supposed to be.
Okay.
Just because it doesn't matter, and he doesn't connect them. And in a weird way, it reminds me of a different way of like if you ever read a just like a sprawling novel that is so packed with characters, you start to understand that the characters don't matter because the author is trying to just show how much shit really exists in the world, right? That this isn't just about one person, it's really about the connection between everything. And so I think that's kind of my hope, trying to put like a positive spin on like what he's trying to do, is that like he's really trying to detach you from the idea that you want this maverick pilot guy to be fucking Bruce Willis because you love Bruce Willis, because who doesn't love Bruce Willis, and you want him to just like solve stuff, right? But in reality, he's like trolling you a little bit, like trying to get you attached, but he really just wants to like give you 13-page essays on relativity and black holes.
Yeah, I think of it as a really long shaggy dog story. Do you guys know what a shaggy dog story is?
Yeah,
No, go on.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's like an extreme. It's just a really long anecdote with a punchline at the end. There's a comedian, Norm Macdonald, who's famous for doing these really long stories that kind of ramble and don't really go anywhere, then for like one joke to hit right at the end. And that's kind of what this book felt like, because the end I thought was funny and solidified the idea that like there's no way to not think of it as a joke. And spoiler alert, when, as Mike sort of mentioned, the one of the pilots goes down to the planet and once he finally realizes that he's face to face with this alien life, the whole world comes crashing down into extinction by the hands of the humans. And
Right.
I don't know, it
First
mate me
and last
laugh.
contact at the same time.
Yeah. It made me laugh, maybe because I was so frustrated that I just started laughing.
I thought that you could interpret it, if you're being really generous, you could interpret it as, well, even between human cultures, the misunderstandings are so profound that we're likely to just react aggressively to each other. And I think certainly
Yes.
the history of the last, even our foreign policy in the last, less than 20 years, you could make that case.
I think just human history in general makes that case.
Yeah, and of course, yeah. Look at human cultures who were fighting throughout the world, throughout history. There's no real indication that this is what Lem is getting at, but if you're rabidly anti-author's intention, then you could certainly interpret it that way.
I like Nick's reading of it as some sort of great Russian novel of here's what's happening in the world, but it's filtered through a sort of projection into the future. Here's what I imagine future intelligence and future reality to sort of look like when it comes to space travel, and that the characters don't need to be there.
Yeah.
It still doesn't make for a fun reading experience unless you're really into science. And I think that might appeal to some people, because I couldn't follow what was happening. I don't know if you guys could. I couldn't.
No, I had a hard time.
It's funny, like I don't want to claim that I can like check out like everything that he's describing, because I'm an engineer for a living, when in reality I just sort of go to meetings and fill out spreadsheets like everyone else. But like he does have a command of like science terms, and he is like playing around with them in a futuristic sense that it does not seem inaccurate. Like he makes just incredibly broad claims and stuff. But I think he really did sit down to just be like, oh, okay, if we're really going to traverse these distances in space, what are the challenges that are going to happen with respect to speed and relativity and how time works? And I think he just got really into it, right?
Yeah. And it feels rooted in reality. It's never that cheesy sort of like pop science fiction where it's like booster drive and all this kind of nonsense. It feels rooted in building on the reality of what was then astrophysics.
Exactly. So I think there's something there, and you kind of mentioned me trying to like tie it into some sort of like Russian novel form, but I'll try to take it in a different quote unquote high literature angle. But I actually got very similar vibes reading this as when we read The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse a little while back.
Okay.
Because that one was also such a struggle, but like there would be these philosophical moments, and then somewhat comically, like the end of at least the first major section of The Glass Bead Game, it is sort of funny in a way when Magister Ludi is like finally feeling good and he finally understands and like hits some level of enlightenment and then just drowns. Yeah. It's like very similar to like, the pilot at the end who like has this moment of reckoning and then just everything just collapses around him. And so I think there's something there where, maybe the format is actually somewhat similar to this other novel that, because it's written by Hermann Hesse and approved and super difficult, that we're into, that did take work. And this one, which I would say is definitely even less enjoyable to that. But maybe it's just because it's like amplifying that characteristic even more, and it's just that much of a struggle for us.
It could be.
I still hated reading it, by the way.
Yeah.
There's no really good place to throw this in there, but another reason I wasn't into it is that there are no women in this book at all, and it's not going to work for me. Like, it's not representative of what we know, first of all, like a space program, however many centuries from now would be. Even in the 80s, we had female astronauts, so, what's going on here? I don't know if that was just laziness on his part or what, but if you're trying to make some kind of representative slice of humanity so that the story feels like it's universal, like you were driving at, Nick, I think that's what you're trying to say, then you at least have to put, you would think, half women in the book, if not even just one.
Yeah, like if you thought the future was so full of all these transformers and hyperdrive space reactors, like you could have also imagined that possibly there'd be some women engineers on board too.
Yeah, especially because there are people from different nationalities, and it's almost like the Pequod, where there's people from different nationalities and they're all united in one task. But of course, there are no women in there in Moby Dick, because historically it wasn't true. If you're kind of looking out into the future, you got to be a little more generous than that.
Yeah, and something that you mentioned that I thought was irritating was how often the Japanese character filtered things through stereotypical Japanese things like Zen and Kabuki theater. Like everything was filtered through him being Japanese in some way.
Yeah. I kept expecting him to pull out a katana, like, and exactly. He says something and someone is like, "Oh, is that Zen?" It's like, oh my God, this is embarrassing.
Well, either we are not trained in reading this book properly, or it's just not a good book. I don't know.
Maybe it's like a blend of both?
Probably every book is a blend of both.
It's true. It's a spectrum.
Yes.
But this one is more difficult, maybe farther out from the average.
Yeah. Now, do you guys read sci-fi?
I mean, I started reading sci-fi as a kid, but like the space opera kind of stuff, I think I read a lot of the Star Wars novels that were out at the time. And then I actually got more into fantasy, so as a kid, and even into like junior high and a little bit in high school, before I then thought that I was getting too nerdy. And as an adult, I will occasionally try stuff. I do like William Gibson, some cyberpunk stuff. But again, I've never tried anything like this, so I was looking forward to it, for sure.
Yeah, I'm kind of like equally uninitiated. I mean, I've read like the Asimovs and the Bradburys and some Dune stuff, and kind of all of like the typical ones that I'm sure like sci-fi people are like, oh, those are the shit books. You don't really know what you're talking about. Or at least that's like, that's the equivalent of liking My Bloody Valentine. Like everybody likes that band. What do you really like? So I guess this was exciting for me to try to like figure out what that like new category is. And I'm just trying to wonder, like I'm always the person that I think like we make fun of a little bit, but I like to read like the super big sprawling books that a lot of people hate. Like your postmodern books, it's a super dirty word now, but like I'm into it, right? And so I just wonder if this book is representative of that type of person in that type of subgenre, and that it really feels the same when somebody's struggling with the thing that I like. And so that's kind of the lens I've been trying to look at this through, of like, maybe I just like straight up don't get it, or I don't get the same like true, like visceral, like emotional appeal of reading this like deep science technical stuff that other people might. I don't know. That's like my guess. That's my best stab at like why this might be a thing that people are into.
I agree. This is not for me. It sounds like it's not for any of us, but bravo for having written it.
But it could be
like
for
I said,
you.
This had to have taken so long to write and think about, really, even before you put a word down. So I think as a technical achievement, it's impressive. I'm not really looking for technical achievements when I'm reading fiction, even difficult fiction.
To me, it's just not the primary thing I'm looking for. And to me, that's what this book feels like. It seems like it's primarily about exploring a few key ideas, which I think would be better served in an essay or a work of nonfiction. Because those key things of plot, characterization, some sort of emotional or moral center, they're lacking or not there.
Yeah. So I guess is that it? Like we tried really hard. We drank a bunch of coffee. We found a bunch of positive things to talk about this book, where in reality it was just like, it was painful.
Yeah, I think if someone turned it off like a third of the way into this podcast, then they would be very excited and go read the book. This is interesting format because we tended to drop the hammer afterwards.
Yeah, so this podcast episode is sort of exactly the same as the book in that respect.
Yeah, for me anyway. I think, David, you hated the first chapter, so...
No, I hated it because it never resurfaced into anything significant.
Okay. I did. Yeah, I agree with that. I was just able to divorce it, decouple it.
Yeah.
So the analogy to this podcast episode continues.
Yeah, join us next month where we read Lem's Solaris. And then the month after that, we're going to do something a little different, and we're going to talk about adaptations and look at how the two film versions of that novel were pulled off or not pulled off. What did they do? How did they do it? Et cetera, et cetera.
Cool.
I am genuinely looking forward to that.
Good times.
All right. Peace.
Woo.
Can I get a what?